Hey, JD.
Good morning, Steve.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you. I was delighted that we get to have another conversation, and you okay that, I don't know, a couple thousand people sit in on it?
That's okay, but they could all get coffee if they wanted to hear about the lean startup, because I think we've talked that to death. We're going to actually talk about how to keep your job and how I lost mine.
So as we get into that, I just want to pull one line from a blog post that you wrote late last year. Speaking of your youth, what I wish I knew was that if you're an early company employee, it's not likely that the skills you have on day one are the skills needed as the company scales to the next level. This sentence is worth reading multiple times, as no one, not the person who hired you, the VCs, or your peers, is going to tell you that when you're hired, the company will likely outgrow you. Steve, that's kind of sobering, advice.
Yep.
What led to this realization for you?
Yeah, so this is a big deal. How many of you are in your first startup? How many in the room and outline? And how many have found product market fit already? Right? There's two of you. I think you're sitting in the front.
There's three. There's one
three.
over here.
So I was at my fourth, maybe third startup, semiconductor company when Silicon Valley actually meant silicon. I was the VP of marketing, and it was literally, I started in the offices of the venture capitalists, and I was either the first employee or the fourth founder, but mostly the first employee, and I was the VP of marketing and acting VP of sales, and doing everything a day one employee does, taking out the garbage, trying to get customers, trying to help engineering understand what customers' needs were, kind of like, customer development before we actually had the words. And I was running around the country and, talking to customers and talking to engineering and talking to everybody and creating like a brand for the startup where none existed. And, we were a little chip company and we decided to take on Intel head on, and we're actually, doing an interesting job. And then one day we kind of had product market fit. We actually went from searching for a business model to, wow, we got design wins, we're about to get another round of financing, and we had a temporary CEO, and now we bring in a new professional CEO. Life is great. How good could this be? And I'm VP of marketing of this thing, also acting VP of sales. Life is wonderful. And the new CEO comes in one day. He's been there about a week, and usually about a week he's figured out where the bathroom was and, figured out who we were, and said, Steve, let's have a talk. Great, what does he want to know, what I've been doing and all these other things. And he says, I think we need to hire a professional VP of marketing. And I went, what do you mean a professional? My business card, I remember literally looking at my business card, said VP of marketing. I'm the VP of marketing. And he kind of took me to school. He said, you've been spending the last year throwing shit against the wall, and some of it stuck, and congratulations, but, you don't know how to manage time. You can't figure out how to prioritize. Can't tell the distinction between tactical and strategic. And we need somebody to help the company scale to the next level. And I don't know if this ever happened to any of you that you've ever been called in for this talk, but it was not just a talk, it was physical. I mean, I physically felt.
You could feel.
It was visceral.
The experience.
I mean, it wasn't like, you're fired is one thing, but this was like a whole different set of feeling. I mean, I was doing the job. I got the company to where it was, and now was being told, well, that's not good enough. That was like, what's going on? And I didn't understand what I understand now.
So if you could go back to that time, that moment that the new CEO is having this conversation.
Yeah, I would have hit him. That's what I. Or at least peed in the corner of his rug. I mean, it's like or something. But I just like, whoa, what's going on? And by the way, that's the purpose of this talk of what was going on. It wasn't the guy was a jerk or an asshole. Well, he was, but that was a separate conversation about what happened here and what will happen to almost half of you in this room. And the fact that it's not a one-off. This is not a Steve story. This is, in fact, a startup story about what happens to startups and early employees, both founders and the early hires who have titles you think you've been given by God for life. Surprise. Surprise.
So what
was your
then
question?
happened in that moment? What followed after that conversation? What did you do? How did you respond?
So like and you know, I still like had a couple of neurons left and said, well, you know, what would it take? What do I need? What kind of skills? He said, well, you're lacking, you know, and he went through all the skills in hindsight, really was missing. You know, I was a very tactical, you know, I could make a great strategy out of disconnected pieces, but I was great at the disconnected pieces, which in hindsight was still exactly what startups do in the early stage. You're searching for a business model. You're not executing one. Big idea. Day one, startups day one are searching for a business model. My definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And I was the perfect VP of marketing for that phase. And so here I was doing all that stuff, and congratulations, I got us to finding what we call product market fit, which was, gee, we got a business model that's now potentially profitable. But he was saying we needed somebody else. So I said, well, I'd like to apply for the job.
I've been doing it. I got cards.
No, I just told you you're not qualified. I said, well, I think I could be. You know, what do I need to learn? And I didn't appreciate this to what he said and did for another decade. He said, well, look, I'm going to start a search, but I'll make you a deal. I'll hire you a coach. A coach. Well, that's kind of great. So he got me actually a coach, and that's all I remember is that there was this like old white-haired guy. You're supposed to laugh, right? I mean, he was like incredibly old, must have been 45. You know, it's like, you know, people have kids that I know that age.
Weathered and ancient.
Ancient. Yeah. And all I remember is we went out to lunch multiple times as this coach was trying to teach me the things I needed. And here's the part I'm really embarrassed about. I was so angry about like, my job that I owned had been taken away from me. I couldn't hear a damn thing. I know the coach's mouth moved and he must have said valuable stuff, but I was just so pissed about how unfair this was, and again, in hindsight, the sense of loss on multiple angles, I didn't hear anything. And about a month later, the CEO came in, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but yet again, I still was, and says, I don't think this is going to work out. We're going to hire person X and Y. And so I quit. And, you know, what else? You know, you said, yeah, I'm sure he offered me some other job, director of marketing, whatever. But my ego was so tied into my identity, I quit. And I probably set back my career 5 years right then. Because I really didn't understand what was going on and the nature of startups at the time. And so I blew a couple of opportunities. I didn't understand this transition from search to build to grow. I didn't understand the skill sets required. And more importantly, I kind of like shut down emotionally in trying to listen to somebody who was actually trying to help me. I swear, I wish I knew what the guy said at lunch. It might have been, you know, order the salad, or it might have been some great advice about how to be a VP of marketing at a different phase of the company.
Let's dig into the loss a little bit there, because in the blog you talk about the different levels of loss that you can now see looking back, but for those who may go through this sort of an experience, what do they need to be prepared for if this happens?
So the biggest thing, you know, if you would have asked me a couple years after about, you know, what had happened, and I just would have said, well, the company outgrew me, and, you know, like, I got pissed off and left. But it turns out it's actually much more interesting than that. At least if, you know, I'm just going to remind all of you at least how I treated startups. And I did 8 of them in 21 years. To me, a startup is the world's shittiest job, but it's the world's best calling. That is, if you're not called to be a founder or an early employee, you're in the wrong business, right? It's a passion-driven, you know, early employees and founders, you're like artists. You see things that other people don't. You hear things that other people don't. And against all odds, whether it's for money or whatever, you're just going to go do this because it's a passion you need to get out of your system. And so, you know, early on, I would have said, well, you know, like, I didn't get it and whatever. but over the decades, I realized that my identity and my status had been tied up in my business card and my title. And so the minute he said I wasn't, like he's going to search for a VP of marketing, it implicitly said, you're not good, and you're not good enough. And it felt like a big loss. The second, so that's one, status and identity, a loss of status and identity. When someone says, we're going to bring in someone else, you failed. And I'll point out later why that wasn't true, but that's what it felt like.
In the moment, it felt like failure.
Oh, man, not only failure, but my status has gone down in my eyes, in the eyes of my peers, and something else. The next one was lack of autonomy. So in the early days, there was no one telling me what to do. I mean, it's like, okay, you're marketing, create a brand, go get some design wins, you're acting as head of sales, do whatever is necessary to help the company survive, help engineering, understand what features were needed, again, find product market fit. So I was doing anything necessary to do that. And on Monday, it might have been X, on Tuesday, it might have been Y. Strategic plan, are you kidding? We don't need plans, we just need to figure out what the heck we're doing, because we were pivoting constantly, at least on the customer side, and somewhat of the product as well. The other loss was the loss of community. I was part of this team, and we were all working together, and it was felt like it felt like a cohesive group. And now we were going to have departments with organization and whatever. That was a loss. And then probably the biggest one for any of you who undergo this, it just felt like the process wasn't fair. I didn't get a memo saying, hey, you're going to work your ass off for the first year or two, and then after you succeed, congratulations, thank you very much, we're going to replace you. Whoa, where's that? And so those things, and I think there was one other. Certainty, right? So, I had the title. I thought it was given to me by God, chiseled in stone. That the only reason I could get removed from that title is if I did something bad. Now, here was the irony. I had done something good. Think about it. I was getting removed from the job because I had done something good, not bad. And so none of that, made sense, and it all added up to this incredible sense of loss. In hindsight, that's what it was. After a decade, I just felt like I lost a lot. Identity and certainty and autonomy, and there was lack of fairness and no process. It just felt terrible. And it turns out there's a lot of literature now that says those kinds of losses actually drive physical feelings. That this comment about it felt viscerally like I was, hit in the stomach and smacked on the head by a 2x4 actually has some physiological and psychological connections. Is when those things happen, you really do feel those things. And so this was a real eye-opener for me. And I see this, by the way, wasn't a Steve story, and it wasn't a story from the dim past. It goes on every day, probably every 33 seconds in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Somebody who's doing a great job in searching for a business model is now being replaced, going through the exact same process, going like I did, what just happened? And how unfair is this? And,
So is there, on the employee side,
Yep.
Is there a way that an employee could be inoculated from this sort of experience? Is if you had different education, different training, different briefing, was there anything that could have prevented this from happening?
I don't know prevented this from happening, but number one is we didn't even have the words to describe how a startup is different than a large company, one, and the skill sets that are needed and why they were different. So, I kept using the word startup search for a business model. And what I mean by that, and now we'll actually drop a little into lean, is, startups on day one is you might write the world's best, quote, business plan, but no business plan survives first contact with customers. And if you're doing some version of lean, what you're actually doing is getting out of the building, talking to customers, building minimum viable products, testing your hypotheses, and searching for, gee, what's the right customer segment and what's the right feature set? When we find those two, that's called product market fit. And that's what it was kind of doing without ever knowing that at MIPS. But the part that we don't write about, or I did years ago in the first book that kicked off the lean startup movement called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, is that the next step is the one you want to get to is, okay, I found product market fit and I have customer validation, now I want to scale. Well, that's an execution game. It's not a search for the business model, it's an execution game. And then the next step after that is I want to grow. Those same skill sets that make you a world class, get out of the building, do lean, on Monday I'm doing X, on Tuesday I'm doing Y, which are necessary for your survival, are actually at times counterproductive for execution. Because in execution, we want to do things that are repeatable and scalable. And so we didn't even have those words. Remember, startups search for business models, large companies execute business models. Search and execution are not the same. And they typically require different skill sets and most often different people. And so to answer your question, number one is I didn't even understand these phases that, yes, the skills that I was wonderful at, which was searching for a business model. The new CEO came in and said, well, that's great. Congratulations, for about a second and a half. I wasn't here when you were running around, not sleeping under the desk, doing all-nighters and whatever. But now we need to get to the next step. And I just did an inventory of your skills, just watching you, and you don't have those. But I didn't understand that wasn't a personal thing from him to me. That was the nature of success. And it's almost like a Greek tragedy, right? It's certainly a Shakespearean tragedy. You do well, and then if you're not careful about that transition, you get punished. And by punished, I don't mean it's personal, but it's just business.
So could he have done anything to have saved you, to have kept you in the company?
So, number one is, if you really think about this story as kind of a timeless story, it's going to happen to some of you. In fact, look around. It's probably happening to the person next to you right now, and it's the ones looking at their shoes going, or updating their resume.
Since this conversation began at 10 o'clock, we have had, no.
Right. So what I tell my students now who are forming startups, and it's hard because this goes counter to the grain, is if your founder's giving out titles to early employees, like on day one, you're going to be the VP of sales, you're going to be the VP of marketing, you're going to whatever, you're almost certainly setting them up for getting fired when they have product market fit. That is, it's, because you fall in love with that title, you've just handed out a title that very rarely can people grow past.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, and I'll give some tips on how to do that. And by the way, I'll give you the first tip is just knowing that the skill set in searching for a business model is different than the next step. It's a big idea. If you're great at operating in chaos, you're almost always uncomfortable in operating in day-to-day process. By the way, it's why world-class founders tend to come from dysfunctional families. Some of you are going, well, that explains it.
Should we list that on LinkedIn as one of our skill sets?
Actually, you should. So it's just as a sidebar. It turns out if you're a survivor of dysfunctional family, you grew up in probably the world's cruelest but most effective training ground to be a startup founder. Is because day to day it was chaotic and uncertain and you never knew what was going to happen, but your survival skills were just to focus on what you needed to get through the day and shut out everything else. And so in a startup, when things are, your co-founder just quit, your largest customer just changed their mind, the toilets have stopped up and you're the head of facilities, you go, normal day, no one died. And where everybody else is kind of freaking out. And I had seen this pattern, certainly in myself, and certainly in others. And I noticed something else interesting. Some of you might notice this. If that's not who you are, you might have worked for one or are working for some of those people, is when people who are great operators in chaos, who come from dysfunctional families, when the company needs to move to repeatable and scalable processes, they throw emotional or physical hand grenades into their company to keep the chaos going. Because that's the I'm talking to you, Elon Musk. Um, you know,
Because that's what's familiar.
That's not only what's familiar, that's the comfort zone.
Yeah.
Because that's the operating regime, and they're great at that operating regime. And by the way, I had noticed this pattern and mentioned it to one of my mentors about 15 years ago, a woman named Catherine Gould, who was one of the earliest women VCs. Unfortunately, she's passed, but Catherine looked at me, and she had also funded one of my companies, and she said, "Steve, that's why we hired you." And I went, "Oh, okay. Well, she's already figured." She said, "That's who all my CEOs are. They have something to prove." But back to this.
So
go
if
ahead.
we could move to the tips that you would offer for employees as they go through this or they see this on the horizon, what would you suggest?
So number one, if you're an early exec and not a founder, I would make sure you have some kind of parachute, because you're not going to last 4 years, period. You're vesting, great, you might have 4-year vesting. Founders nowadays get restricted stock and that, but if you're like the first VP of sales or VP of marketing or VPs of engineering, you usually get some other title and get to stay in, but sales and marketing, you're out of here, or VP of revenue. You're not going to last those 4 years, yet your work is front-loaded. It's a big idea. I believe your work in searching for a business model is as valuable as someone else's next 4 years in executing the model. Yet your half-life is about 18 months. Oops. If you could get some other deal. Second is, if you really do want to work in this startup for a long time, don't take a title.
Be flexible.
No,
be able to be
don't take a title.
Yeah.
I'm like, title should just say customer development or something, or revenue or whatever, because the odds are it will go into execution mode. And if you're interested in the company's growth because you own a lot of stock, you actually want that person in the company if that's not your skill set or you're not interested in doing that. I hated that part of it. I was able to do that. My last company, Epiphany in year 3 had $125 million of revenue and $8 billion market cap, but we hired a professional CEO because I hated that stuff. Got 800 people, blah, 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 but I was more interested in the finding the business model. If that's what you love, but you want to stay, don't trap yourself into something that boxes you into a corner. The second part is, from the CEO's point of view.
That's just where I was going to go. What would you offer to the leaders?
From the CEO's point of view, when you transition people and they leave, you're losing this entire community of knowledge. And we tend to devalue the people who got us here. And there is usually no history and no celebration. I'm not talking about the founders, I'm talking about the tough path of how did we go from startup to company that's now either found product market fit or cash flow positive or something. You weren't born that way, meaning your company wasn't born that way, you kind of got there. How do we celebrate that culture and people? And two is, and this is what VCs don't want you to know, is they don't want you to know this story. That is, it's not an investor's interest to say, hey, congratulations, you're the first VP of sales and VP of marketing, and they know you have a bummer of a birthmark on the back of your back, which is a bullseye. It's like, there you are. And so this is something that's been happening for decades. We can now explain why it happens. And in fact, if you're an early employee, you could now plan for this happening and make it a kind of a joyous event rather than like a dismal event.
So this wasn't in what we talked about to prep for this, but as you're speaking, how do I, as an employee, sustain my focus and energy? Like, I'm right now leading Columbia's new West Coast campus. How do I keep that energy and that momentum moving forward when I see that 18-month horizon, or I feel like the clock is ticking?
I've now told you how to look into the future. So I've told you now how to see the future. The future, the success, is product market fit. That's like a chasm, and you need to decide whether you want to cross into the promised land or stay on the mountain and not cross into the promised land. And if you want to cross into the promised land, you're going to have to learn a new set of skills fairly rapidly. And if you don't want to cross into the promised land, you need to know, like the rest of the organization is going to go there with or without you.
And by doing that, we end up having some agency.
You bet.
Inside of our career and inside of our startups.
And then you could control your future. If you could see your future, you could control it.
That's a great line to end on.
Right.
Thank
Well,
you so much,
Thank you very
Steve.
much. Take care. Thanks.